Hey guys, hello and welcome back to my channel. This is Kshitij, and on this channel we talk about robotics, research and academia. In the previous video, we talked about how to identify research gaps, the various types and the pitfalls. If you missed out on that video, the link will be in the I button above. Be sure to watch that video before you watch this one because this is a follow-on video. So now that you have identified what a research gap is, the next obvious question or the cliffhanger that we left the previous video on was how do you plug it, right? So you've identified a gap where your thesis can contribute. The thing now is to write a proposal around it to explain how you're going to do it. This is what today's video is all about. It's about writing a good research proposal. So what is a research proposal? Research proposal is essentially a proposal of your contributions that you're expecting to make as a part of your thesis in order to fill the gaps in the current literature. This comes in several different sections, which we're going to discuss next. There are several important building blocks of a proposal, which you can see here in the table right in front of me. The first thing that you should consider is the title. Now, understand that at this stage, you are just kind of preparing ahead of time, right? So you haven't started doing your research. This is just in the initial stages. So this title that you're going to propose will likely not be your final thesis title. This is just a tentative title at this stage. Now, what makes for a good title? So think of a title as a collection of keywords that somebody would need to search for if they want to find your work. But this is not just an arbitrary collection of keywords written out with some commas and semicolons in the middle, right? So if you look for some research papers, they would have some index terms or keywords which are separated by commas. That's a different way of writing the keywords, but the concept is the same. Here you try to formulate it in a short, concise statements and drop the prepositions and conjunctions in the middle. And this necessarily would not be the final title, as I said. It would change as the research progresses, but oftentimes it doesn't change drastically. It just gets polished over time. So for example, for my thesis, the title was Multi-Robot Exploration for Environment Monitoring, a Resource-Constrained Perspective. This is not the title I started with, but this is the title I finished with, right? So as you can see, the keyword here is multi-robot, exploration, environment monitoring, and the contribution that I made was to look at a novel perspective, which was a resource-constrained perspective. So this title has a collection of keywords that I want people to search for if they were to search for my work. The next thing is the abstract. So after the title, you have an abstract, which is say about 100 to 200 words, depending on the requirements across different universities. And this abstract is a bit shorter than the other abstracts because this is just a proposal at this stage, right? So of course you have done some initial thinking, but this is not a detailed analysis yet. So keep it short, but think of it like as a brief summary of what comes up next in the rest of the proposal. So what is the thing that you've identified is a gap in the literature, how you're planning to fix it, and what methods you're going to use and how it enhances over state of the art. So something like that summarized in about 100 to 200 words. Now the sections we're discussing might slightly vary across different universities, but more or less this is like the typical template of writing a research proposal. We'll get back to the abstract at the very end because this is normally how I would write a proposal as well. So I leave out the abstract till the last stages because first I want to write down the rest of the sections so that my thoughts are clear as to what is it that I'm trying to do and the essential things that I want the reader to take away from the abstract. You could do it the other way around if you're already familiar with what the rest of the sections are, and otherwise follow it this way. So we'll get back to this in just a second. The next section is the research aim. So let me delete a few of these extra rows and oops, yeah. And the aim is essentially a single statement summary of what real world issues that you're planning to solve. So it's like a summary of the research gaps that you've identified. Now think of the aim as like I call it the 2-sip coffee test. So think of it like explaining it to your grandma who doesn't know anything what you're doing. And you just have a couple of minutes by the time your grandma finishes the last 2 sips of the coffee or tea that she's drinking. So this needs to be concise, and it should summarize exactly what your aim is with the thesis. Why do you want to do it? Now, aim is slightly different from the objectives, which is the next segment, right? So as you can see, the example for my thesis, the aim of the research was to evaluate the role of robots towards environment monitoring to curb rising pollution levels in the city. That was a single statement summary of my aim. What is the purpose of my thesis? Now, objectives, I think of it as slightly differently from the aim, although some people use the terms together. Summary of what has been done. So it's, I could think of it as a research background. So what the other people have already done, what is the state of the art, and the gap as to what needs to be figured out, which could be something like understanding something, identifying something, measuring something, explaining a relationship between something, and what data needs to be collected. So these are my research objectives, right? So it's a bit more detailed. This is not the same as the project objectives. Project objectives are typically the tasks that you will need to do on a day-to-day basis to finish the project, which is your thesis, which is just like the timeline, which is one section of this proposal we'll get to towards the end of this video. So these are just your research objectives, or let's say background of the research, if you really want to call it that way. So in my case, it was identifying the machine learning models that could be used to model the underlying phenomena and how the robot can help with data acquisition. So you see the terms like identify and how to help and things like that. So you could continue building on top of this to identify the gaps in the literature and so on and so forth. Next up are the research questions. Now, the way I like to think of them, I think of them as a hierarchical description of the research question. So I always keep one central research question, which is going to be the foundation of my research. And then I try to break it down into several sub-research questions so that I can divide and conquer. Now remember, even though it's hierarchical, all sub-questions at the lower level of the hierarchy all contribute to the central research question. So you could think of it like making a circle where everything points towards the central research question, right? So the central research question, as I said, is the foundation of your research. So think of like that $1 million question that you're going to identify, and then break it down into sub-questions. So I guess that is a bit clearer to you. So for example, in my case, the central research question was machine learning models are data hungry, but a robot has only limited resources. It can only fly for so long, move for so long, and only compute so much amount of data, right? So how can we trade off the limited battery life to the quality and quantity of the data acquired to attain maximum model accuracy? As you can see, this is a $1 million question. It ends with a question mark. So it's my central research question. Then I break it down into RQ1, RQ2, RQ3. It could be multiple research questions. And the finer you break it down, the more manageable the research becomes, right? All research questions are answered under a set of hypotheses. Now, hypotheses are slightly different from research assumptions. They are assumptions, yes, but hypotheses are statements or assumptions which can be evaluated and you can find evidence to prove or disprove them. So, for example, one of the hypotheses that I had was if the robot operate at a constant velocity, they consume fixed amount of energy per unit time. This is very easy to evaluate, right? So if I fix the velocity of motion of a robot, I just measure the amount of energy and evaluate it across the mission duration. And I have my evidence whether or not this is true or false. So this hypothesis can be evaluated, and the research question, the answer that I find to them would be valid under a set of hypotheses. So this is something that you should also try and identify. What hypotheses are you going to base your answers on? Because if any of these hypotheses is disproved, your answer falls apart. And the way you could use these several research questions that you've identified is to map them into different publications. That's why I like it to break it down. So for example, you could think of RQ1 to be good enough for a conference paper, RQ2 to be big enough for a journal paper, a combination of three of them to be good enough for a book chapter, and so on and so forth. So you could also, break down the central research questions into multiple sub-questions which lead to multiple publications. So this helps you evaluate what are going to be the publications / research contributions towards the end of your thesis. And if you arrange them in the form of a block diagram, right? So the big block is the central research questions and then sub blocks each feeding into each other. So the sequential arrangement would help you understand which question gets solved first and which comes after, and how do the results of the previous question feed to the next question, and the whole kind of flow of the process. So you have to solve this question, publish that question first before you move to the next question, and things like that. So that's why I like to break it down into multiple sub-questions. After you've explained all your research questions, hypotheses, and expected outputs, that comes the methodology. So you've so far explained what are the things you're interested in identifying, but the question remaining is how you're going to do it, right? So explain your approach to finding the answers to the questions, whether you're going to be conducting some experiments, whether you're going to be taking some human participants, whether it's going to be a bunch of surveys and things like that. Like how you're going to go about finding evidence for the research questions you've identified. And explain your methodology, which is typically done in one of three ways. Either you're going to do it in a quantitative analysis, which means you do a bunch of data gathering and then you do some statistical analysis of the data, or it could be qualitative, so you describe and conceptualize what happened with the analysis after you've done the studies, or you could do a hybrid, or so on and so forth. So you have to explain how you're going to go about with the data collection to find the evidence, and how you're going to analyze once the data is collected. That is your methodology. One thing that I also like to make a part of methodology, or perhaps a different section depending on the guidelines of the proposal that you have got, is the risk analysis. This is something students often overlook in the beginning days of the proposal, but I've found this to be an essential part of the proposal. Risk analysis is essentially a matrix that I like to make where I'm anticipating things that could go wrong in the research. Because remember, in research, anything and everything that can go wrong will go wrong. It's real life after all. Nothing goes according to plan because plan has too many assumptions, right? So you're already trying to anticipate things that could go wrong. For example, if you place an order to acquire some piece of hardware, maybe it gets delayed. If you want human participants for some study, maybe it gets delayed because now is the pandemic and things like that, right? Things people never see coming. So try and imagine things like that, and don't speculate too much, but already try to identify things that would have an impact or a risk of delaying your thesis. And basically this would be in the form of a table where you have identified a risk, and it could have the level of risk, could be high or low or medium. It could have the impact on your research, could be high or low or medium as well. And then contingencies. Don't just identify the risk, but also explain what are the contingencies you have in mind to tackle if something like that goes wrong, which basically shows to people that you have thought this thing through and you're ready with plan B, plan C, and plan D in case if things go sideways. This shows evidence that you have kind of put your mind into the problem, you've thought this through, you're ready to give it all, okay? After all of this comes the timeline. This is another undervalued part of your proposal, but don't take it for granted. Think it through. You have about 3 years or 4 years for doing your PhD thesis. So break it down. Establish milestones for yourself. For example, literature review is one milestone, risk analysis is one milestone, or whatever. Call it work packages, call it milestones, call it whatever you want, but break it down into checkpoints that you think, okay, after I have achieved this much amount of work in this much amount of time, I am going okay. Otherwise, I'm going slow or fast or whatever. You need a reference to compare it. So this is where you could essentially make a Gantt chart where you say, okay, the previous task feeds into this task, and you could make arrows to show how they progress, or you could have slightly overlapping tasks. So by the time you're approaching the end of one task, you're already starting the other one, and things like that. Now, this is not something where you have to stick to 100% and it's very rigid, it's flexible, because again, you're thinking 3 to 4 years down the line. So of course, things change, a lot happens along the line, but the more thought you put into this at this time, the easier it would be for you to manage your time as things evolve, okay? Last but not the least is the bibliography. So remember, in one of the previous videos, we talked about preparing a literature review database. So in the early days of your thesis, of course, you will be reluctant to do a very exhaustive literature review because there is a chance that you may or may not proceed with the topic, because when you write this proposal, then it's up to your supervisor to either approve or disapprove this idea, right? So there is still a chance that that would not be your final aspect that you're going to research on. So you would be reluctant and you'd only be reading a few papers. That's okay. Of course, you have to evaluate the trade-off of the efforts you put in and the time it takes to write a good research proposal, right? So even if you read a bunch of papers, cite them here when you're making some statements. Quote them as a reference and have the reference in the bibliography to say, okay, if so-and-so is being done, cite it. Related works, cite them. That is the problem that you've identified in the literature. Okay, because there is no citation for that. So it becomes a bit clearer, and cite the reputable publications for something like this so that people can, it becomes a bit more believable then. Okay, so these are some of the parts of a research proposal that you should think about and start formulating what is it that you're going to do to contribute to the research gap that you've identified. Now let's look at the abstract, which we left out for the last part, right? So after going through all of these segments, now you are in a good mindset to write the abstract, because you know what methodologies you want to use, you know the limitations of the state of the art, you also know the timeline and the risk that you're expected to face. So think of the abstract as a brief summary of all of these sections and what is it that you intend to do. When writing an abstract, think of it from a point of view that a very busy reader is going to read it. And let's say your proposal is some 8 to 10 pages or whatever, and they don't have the time to read everything. So if they read the title and the abstract, do they get a good overall understanding of what is it that you want to do or not? That is like an introspection kind of exercise that you could do when writing this up. So I hope this video clears things out for you. So after you've identified the research gap, the next step is to write a research proposal and how you break it down and what are the different sections that you could expect. Be sure to like and share this video with other early stage researchers and subscribe to my channel to stay tuned as and when the next video goes live. Hope you found this useful and have a nice day.